Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
To get back to Gnosticism specifically, one of the fascinating things is that even though over 1,000 years ago it was pretty much completely eradicated by the Catholic Church, there seems to be a rebirth.
Yeah, and this rebirth really can be dated back to the 18th century when at least a few of these texts were starting to surface. Mm-hmm. And there was also an increased revolt against Christian orthodoxy. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, if you were revolting against Christian orthodoxy, Protestant, Catholic, whatever, the Gnostics were a logical place to go to. Mm-hmm. Now, one very famous example is William Blake. Mm. You know, certainly one of the greatest poets and artists.
18th century.
Yes, mm-hmm. 18th century. Now, there's a passage from a friend of Blake's in which he says, I went over to Blake's and, we're talking about religion and I heard the teachings of the ancient Gnostics just repeated to me, pretty much in pure form. So Blake, insofar as he understood the Gnosticism as it was known in his day, mm-hmm. embraced it. And that is to say, one of the themes of this is that the God of the law, the lawgiver, is, shall we say, a defective, legalistic, second-rate God, and that the true God is, shall we say, a God of love and illumination beyond mm-hmm. that. Now, Blake, I think, did something very, very important because he realized that this defective God...
We're referring to, I think the term is demiurge?
The demiurge, mm-hmm. which is from a Greek word meaning craftsman. Mm-hmm. The second-rate God was, in a sense, part of the structure of our own minds. Mm-hmm. Blake's name for this demiurge was Urizen. Mm-hmm. Funny word, and it has many meanings. Greek urizein, to limit, your eyes, mm-hmm. horizon, mm-hmm. all of these things. This is the part of the mind that limits and constricts. Mm-hmm. You can read. There's a book of Urizen, complete with pictures.
Yes, William Blake was a poet and an artist, yes. A visionary and a mystic.
Yeah, and of course he was, like many people ahead of his time, he was not completely understood and not completely liked. Mm-hmm.
So that would be one example of the
revival.
There are others.
There are others.
Swedenborg, I think.
Yeah, Swedenborg himself, Emanuel Swedenborg was a Swedish visionary of the 18th century. Mm-hmm. And he certainly didn't have, to my knowledge, he did not embrace the Gnostics as a group past or present, but he did believe that it was time for the spiritual eyes of humanity to be opened, mm-hmm. and he believed that was his kind of his job. And he had these elaborate visions of heaven and hell, which he wrote out. His books became mm-hmm. very, very popular. Mm-hmm.
He was a scientist.
He started out as a scientist, yes, he did.
And an engineer.
He was on the Swedish Board of Mines. Mining was Sweden's big business, and he mm-hmm. was connected with it. So this, in going on into the 20th century, the most important figure to really bring the Gnostics back was C.G. Jung. Mm-hmm. And Jung felt a deep affinity for the Gnostics.
The great Swiss psychiatrist.
Yes. Yeah. And he wrote a really strange text, kind of what would be today called a channel text. It's called The Seven Sermons to the Dead. Mm. And he wrote it in a trance state. And the speaker is Basilides, who was one of the great Gnostic teachers of the 2nd century. Mm-hmm. This is interesting. And, he goes on and uses a lot of Gnostic terms in this, and it's arguable that a lot of Jung's later psychology and psychiatry are derived from these ideas and are expressed there very, very cryptically. I mean, this is just a few pages, but it's a very dense and mysterious text.
Well, what you're saying suggests that Jung, who was a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, one of the founders of a major school of psychotherapy and psychology, derived much of his teachings from his own inner visions that were, let us say, compatible with the work of the ancient Gnostics and I think the ancient alchemists and therefore the Hermetic tradition as a whole.